morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Colin Talbot. I shall let him tell you all about himself, and I know you submitted some questions, and he has those, but I'm sure there'll be an opportunity to ask some more if any are raised by his talk today. So pass you over. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Colin Talbot. I'm Emeritus Professor of Government at the University of Manchester. The emeritus bit just means I'm retired. They don't pay me anymore, but they do give me access to the library, so that's quite nice. I've worked both as an academic, but I've also worked in the public sector, and I've done a lot of consultancy and advisory work, both with the British government, with the Scottish government, Northern Ireland government, and about 20 overseas governments, including the administration in the United States and Canada and Japan and various other places. So I've been around a bit, as it were, to see how different governments work. And that's one of the things that's quite interesting, because you don't really understand how your own system works until you've had a look at how other people do it, which is a useful pointer for the future. So what I wanted to talk about today was to keep it fairly topical and try and explain some things about British government, but through the lens of what's happened around the COVID crisis and how things have been organised in response to that, because I thought that would be a bit more interesting than a dry talk about the British Constitution or lack of, and all of those sorts of things. So I'm going to start off by talking a bit about COVID and also the general structure of British government, and then we'll get into some more specifics. And I've already had some questions sent in, and I'm partly responding to some of those in this introduction, but I want to try and make it as interactive as possible. So I'm going to try and talk for about half an hour or so, and then open it up for questions and discussion. So first of all, just COVID itself, I think it's really important to understand right from the start that coronaviruses are social diseases. They are things which spread through the human population by contact. And as a result, it's really, really important that governments are involved in helping to manage them. And each country's circumstances in relation to the global pandemic that we're facing are very, very different. So if you compare, for example, Australia and the UK, which I know our government is currently doing in terms of thinking about how we ease ourselves out of lockdown eventually, it's very easy to make mistakes about the geography, the layout and the politics of different countries. So Australia, for example, the vast majority of the population live in a handful of population centres around the coast, and they're very spread out, and they have a federal government system, all of which makes it very different from the sort of circumstances we have in the UK. So let's just turn briefly to the UK itself. First of all, governments rather than government. People tend to think of the government dealing with it, and if you watch the news broadcasts, you'll see the health secretary popping up regularly talking about it. What they don't often say clearly enough is that Matt Hancock is the health secretary essentially for England, not for Scotland, not for Wales, and not for Northern Ireland. We have 3 devolved governments for those areas who have most of the responsibility for virtually everything to do with health in their territories. So to that extent, we've got a slightly decentralised, sort of semi-federalised structure to the UK. We also have, within England alone, we have nearly 350 local authorities who have some responsibility for health matters. And historically, we've divided health matters between central government, or governments in the case of Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and local authorities. So public health, which again you'll see talked about quite a lot around the COVID crisis, is actually mainly managed by local authorities, and there are directors of public health in each local authority area who are responsible for public health issues in their localities. The NHS itself, we talk about it as a national health service, but it's not really a national health service in the sense that the health service in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland is run by their respective devolved administrations. And even within England, there's a lot of devolution or decentralisation in the structures of the health service. So although it's reports to the Secretary of State for Health, there's a lot of layers and tiers below that in terms of the structures. So I think the first general point to make is that you'll quite often hear people say that in comparison to other countries, the UK has a very centralised government system and a very centralised public sector. That's partially true. It's also quite decentralised in relation to the devolved administrations, but within England we have a fairly centralised system, and a lot of what public health directors, for example, are allowed to do is constrained quite a lot by what central government does and allows them to do. So that's the sort of general context which we're operating in. How's the government responded? One of the questions we got is, do you think the government has managed the COVID situation well? Well, the simple answer is no. I don't think it's handled it particularly well, particularly if you look in comparison to other countries. At the moment, we are in the unenviable position of being world beating in one thing, which is we're top of the league table for deaths per million due to the COVID virus. And that suggests that despite being one of the richest countries in the world, despite having one of the best health and public health systems in the world, we haven't actually managed it terribly well. And I'll come on later to, I think, some of the reasons why I think that's happened. But just generally, first of all, the first big mistake we made right at the beginning of the crisis was to ignore the advice from the World Health Organization, which was to test whenever you get a pandemic like this, whether it's a coronavirus or a flu virus or whatever it is. Testing is absolutely essential to understand what's going on, to understand the spread of the virus, how it's moving around through the population, and hopefully then be able to take measures to control it. And right at the very beginning of the crisis, back in February, March last year, the government decided that, it initially did some testing in the community, but then it abandoned community testing completely for a couple of months because it said the virus was out of control and there was no point in testing. And that was a very, very, very serious mistake. And we also didn't have, and I'll come back to this in a bit, we didn't have the capacity set up to be able to test adequately across the country. And when we did decide we wanted to do it, we went about doing it in the wrong way. The second point, which is quite remarkable really in the context, particularly of the debate about Brexit that we've been having for the last 4 or 5 years. And one of the central slogans is taking back control of our borders around the whole Brexit issue, is that we didn't actually have control of our borders in relation to COVID, unlike a lot of other countries, particularly some of the other island countries like, well, Australia is a continent by itself, but particularly New Zealand and Taiwan and some of the others. We didn't take control of people coming into the country and testing them for COVID. And many travellers coming in, including some of my friends, said you just swam through Heathrow. They tell you had to go home and isolate for 14 days. Nobody bothered checking up whether you were or not. You weren't tested to see whether or not you had the coronavirus. And if you go back to the studies that took place immediately after the first wave of coronavirus in spring last year, they traced at least well over 1,000 instances of where coronavirus had been imported either by British citizens coming back to the UK or visitors coming into the UK. So we had multiple points of entry of the virus, which is part of the reason why the first phase of the pandemic in the UK was quite as widespread and broad as it was. So we didn't really do that. And the second thing we didn't do was, because it is a social virus and it spreads through social contacts, one of the first things the government should have done, which they did in places like New Zealand and Taiwan, was have severe restrictions on social contacts, as much as we were able to do without completely shutting down the economy. And I think most people agree now, interestingly, Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Officer, was saying this only this week, that we moved far too slow and not hard enough in terms of trying to shut down social contacts, closing schools, closing universities, stopping things like the Cheltenham racecourse meeting that took place after we knew the virus was already spreading, and extraordinarily slow in responding to it in that respect. So we didn't have test and trace set up. We didn't have a border control set up properly, and we were very slow into the lockdowns. If we go back a little bit in history, it's quite interesting because in the early 2000s, we had a series of national problems. The flooding that we had in the early 2000s, the outbreak of foot and mouth disease we had in 2003, 2004, and there were also several near disasters with emergence of pandemic viruses in the Far East with SARS and MERS. And in response to that, the then Labour government set up a whole review of civil contingencies planning, as it's called, which is basically what do you do in an emergency? How does government respond in an emergency? They put through fresh legislation in 2005. They set up a whole set of planning systems and coordination systems between central, local government and all the various public sector agencies. So we should have been in a fairly strong position to respond to a civil emergency like a pandemic. And in fact, only, where are we, 3-4 years before this particular pandemic, we had a rehearsal in central government for what happened if we had a flu pandemic, which is what, in terms of pandemics, that's what a lot of the focus was around, expecting that we'd have some sort of influenza outbreak. Government went through that, did a whole role-playing exercise of seeing what would happen if we had a flu pandemic, identified there were huge gaps by that time in the contingencies planning system, which this was 10 years later from when New Labour had revised the whole system, put a whole load of new things in place, and it had been neglected, shall we say, and run down. And that was identified 3 or 4 years before the pandemic struck, but government didn't do anything about it because it was busily concerned with Brexit and various other issues, and it wasn't seen as being a major priority. Which was something we've obviously come to regret later on. And one of the key issues around that was the lack of preparation in relation to emergency supplies of things like PPE, which is personal protective equipment in hospitals. If you think back to what happened at the beginning of last year, we had a really big problem in hospitals with supplies of PPE. My daughter is a critical care nurse in London. She was working with COVID patients on her ward with completely inadequate PPE equipment. They only had the proper equipment for the people working in ICU, in the intensive care units. And we had a major problem trying to ramp up supply of PPE equipment right at the beginning. We also had a major problem with the availability of testing when we did decide later in the spring, early summer to start mass testing properly. We didn't have the capacity to do it. Now, this is where I think there were some really serious organisational mistakes made by central government. Government decided that what it was going to do was have a, first of all, this, and I'm referring here to the English government, not to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. They've all done slightly different things, but within England, government decided to concentrate on, first of all, a highly centralised response of setting up large-scale facilities. They decided to do that for emergency facilities around health care for people who come down with COVID. So we had the setting up of the Nightingale hospitals, which was done incredibly quickly. If you remember, the Nightingale Hospital in London was set up in the space of a couple of weeks. But they also did it, which people hadn't. Oh, sorry. That's my clock talking to me for some reason. The other thing they did was decide to do the same sort of thing around other aspects of the response to the virus. First of all, around testing, you need laboratories to do the testing. The government decided that what it would do is set up new testing facilities in what were called lighthouse laboratories. We've got one down the road from me in Milton Keynes, and they initially set up 3 or 4 of them. And they said at the time they were doing that because we didn't have the testing capacity in the UK that somewhere like Germany had. Well, that actually isn't true. There were something like 100 laboratories based in universities, in the private sector, in some voluntary sector, third sector organisations like the Wellcome Trust, which is a large charitable research organisation, who were all volunteering to turn over their laboratories to use for testing. But because the government had decided to go down this road of setting up these very large lighthouse laboratories, they actually turned down offers of testing facilities from universities and others who could have been turned over very easily to it. And we could have ramped up capacity for testing much quicker. And also, I think, importantly here, and there's an important organisational lesson here, if you're responding to a crisis like this, yes, there's a need for a certain amount of central direction, but there's a real danger in setting up very centralized facilities, which is if you set up very big facilities like the Lighthouse Lab in Milton Keynes, if anything goes wrong, you lose all that capacity. So there've been 2 occasions where the Lighthouse Lab in Milton Keynes, once because of an outbreak of COVID amongst the staff, and once because of technical and supply issues, where it's virtually collapsed and has been unable to process anything. One of the advantages about using all the other facilities that existed, which is the university labs, the charity sector labs and so on, and private sector pharmaceutical companies' labs, would have been that it would have been highly distributed. And if one of them had fallen over, it wouldn't have been a major problem. And you would have been able to transfer testing capacity around. So that's, I think, the first mistake that they made, which was over-centralizing and making these things far too large. They're useful as backups, but doing it as the primary way of doing it, particularly when you didn't have them set up in advance and you had to build them from scratch and staff them and equipment and all the rest of it, where it slowed things down enormously. And they made the same mistake, and which was even worse in lots of ways, with, first of all, the actual physical testing, taking samples from people, which is they set up this thing called NHS Test and Trace, which was a sort of parallel structure outside of the NHS, run by private sector companies, Serco, the security company, Deloitte's an accountancy agency who were in charge of the actual test collection facilities. And I've never quite figured out why you put accountants in charge of test collection, but never mind. And a whole bunch of other private sector organisations, when we already had a network of NHS facilities that could have done the testing. We had thousands of GPs. We have pharmacies community pharmacies who could provide testing facilities. We had local NHS hospitals and community hospitals who could have provided testing facilities. Yet again, the government went for setting up these very large testing facilities. And by the middle of the summer, if you remember, we were having these situations, whereas if you try to apply for a test, I actually tried to get one back in August, and we were being offered, I live in Bedford, and we were being offered places like Manchester and Bristol to go and get a test done, which was crazy when we've got facilities all over Bedford, which would have been quite easy to use to take test samples. They then had the mass processing of the tests through the Lighthouse laboratories. And then thirdly, they also set up another centralized system for tracing people. Now, tracing in a situation where you've got a pandemic like this is incredibly important for being able to trace contacts, advise people they've been in contact with somebody who's got the disease, and say you need to self-isolate. They decided to do that by throwing several £billion at this NHS testing structure, which was completely new, set up from scratch, when we already had public health directors in nearly 350 local authorities around the country who've got teams of people who do this sort of work all the time. If you have a outbreak of a food poisoning or a sexually transmitted disease or anything else like that in a locality, it's the director of public health and their teams who trace the contacts and try and work out where it's come from. And if it's food poisoning, is it coming from a factory or a restaurant or wherever it is in the food chain? And they were all there, but the government decided to set up this parallel structure completely separate from the structures that were already existed. So all of those things, I think, were unfortunate, to put it mildly. And this isn't a political criticism, it's an organisational incompetence criticism, and it's also not, I'm not opposed to bringing private companies in at all to help in situations like this, but they were using the wrong private companies. So instead of using the pharma companies, the pharmaceuticals companies for testing, they were using Deloitte and Serco to help set up these systems, which to me makes no sense at all. So were there alternatives to all of this? Well, yes, obviously. We could have used the existing public sector structures, health and local government in particular in the localities, but also aided by other parts of the public sector. First of all, to build out from competencies and structures that were already there. So we had expertise in testing people, we had expertise in processing tests, and we had expertise in tracing people and trying to suppress the virus that way, none of which were used properly. Now, you can speculate on why that happened precisely. I think there is a political element to that, which is that we have a government at the moment which is ideologically committed to privatisation, outsourcing government services where it can. That shouldn't have stopped it involving the right parts of the private sector at a local level and to some degree at a national level, but it did. But it also combines something which we've always had a problem with in UK government, which is that for the best part of a century now, there's been a tendency to centralise British government, to nationalise everything. You've seen at the moment, for example, both now Labour were campaigning for and the Conservatives now appear to be adopting the idea that the way to sort out the social care problems for the elderly in particular is to nationalise the care service and create a single national care service alongside the National Health Service in England, at least. And again, it's this almost knee-jerk reaction that the way to sort things out is to create some sort of national structure to do it, when in a lot of other countries the response would be to decentralise these things and do these things at a local level. And I'll just give you an example completely separate from the response to COVID. We happen in this country, and people will sort of take it for granted, to have a single national tax agency, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. We used to have two. Customs and Inland Revenue were separate agencies, and they were amalgamated a decade or so ago. So we have a single national tax collection agency, which collects the vast majority of taxes, income tax, corporation tax, VAT, right across the whole of the UK. It's very interesting if you go to some other countries and look at how they do it. In Denmark, for example, all taxes are collected locally. The local authorities are responsible for collecting income tax, corporation tax, their equivalent of VAT. The tax rates are set by national government, but the collection is done by local authorities, and it works extremely well. But Denmark has a much higher tax compliance rate than the UK does. And it's partly because the local tax inspectors based in local authorities know their areas extremely well. and are much more likely to spot when people are trying to fiddle things by claiming that they're poverty stricken when they've got a swimming pool and 3 BMWs parked outside the front of the house. So localized systems can work in combination with national setting of tax rates. We tend to not do that in this country, particularly in England, although interestingly, although we devolved a lot of power to the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, in Scotland in particular, which I know a bit about, there's been a tendency for the Scottish government to centralise things on Edinburgh. The same complaints come up in Wales, but particularly in Scotland. So, for example, in Scotland now, instead of having, I can't remember exactly how many it was police forces they used to have, they now have a single police force for the whole of Scotland. Is one of the examples of some centralisation that's taken place. We've devolved power to Scotland, but then they've centralised power within Scotland, taking it away from local authorities and local structures. So overall, I think there's lots of other things where I think the government's made mistakes around the COVID process and caused all sorts of problems around it. I have a strong personal interest in this, not just because my daughter's been working with the problem for the last 11 months, but I'm one of the clinically extremely vulnerable group, so I've been shielding for the last 11 months. So this room is beginning to feel a bit like a prison cell at the moment. Even though it's very nice having all my books and things here, I just wish we could have got out of lockdown. I've been talking to a lot of my academic friends around the globe about the way in which their governments have dealt with these things, and I know circumstances are very different in different countries, but talking to colleagues in Australia where they're extremely upset because they've had nearly 1,000 deaths in Australia, 1,000, compared to, we are up to, what is it, nearly 90,000 or just gone above 90,000 now. And colleagues in New Zealand where they've had even far less than that, and they've been back to normal. They haven't had a single death since September. And they're more or less back to normal, and they had a fairly normal Christmas and were able to behave normally. So government can make a huge difference to how we cope with these things. I know it's a global pandemic. I know nobody expected this precise disease with these precise characteristics, but we've known that there's going to be something like this happening at some point, and governments could have been and should have been a lot better prepared for dealing with them than they have been. Okay, should we move on to, I'll just go through some of the questions I've already been sent in, and then we can open it up for questions as well. I've already done one. Somebody said, why would you say that despite being the 6th wealthiest nations in the world, there's an argument about that at the moment, about whether we're 6th or 7th, the UK has had one of the highest infection rates and highest death rates in the world? Well, I think we've explained some of that. I think some of the factors, to be fair to government, are to do with the fact that Britain is a very international, open country with very high levels of transit through the country for business purposes. We're a global financial centre, which means lots of people coming in and out of the country and so on. So there are some mitigating factors, but even so, we've had a particularly bad response. Do I think if a different political party had been in power, the situation would have been resolved more quickly? For example, the way in which Jacinda Ardern of the Labour Party in New Zealand has managed the situation a lot better. No, I don't think a political party would have made much difference. I think it would have been the attitude of the leaders in dealing with the pandemic. And interestingly, some countries have dealt with it in a very different way. So in Australia, for example, they instituted a sort of COVID cabinet made up of members of the Australian federal government, the territorial state level governments, and they did it across party lines to coordinate and make sure that they had a united response to what was going on. It would certainly have been possible to do something like that here, and instead we've jumped about, where sometimes COBRA, the coordinating committee, subcommittee of the cabinet, which deals with emergencies, has invited in other national, subnational leaders, like the leaders of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and the metropolitan mayors like Sadiq Khan in London, and at other times they've excluded them. We could have, I think, done that much better. So I don't think it's about political parties so much as the political structures that we've got, and the government structures not working terribly well. Do I think allowing household mixing in non-tier 4 areas was significant in the second wave we're seeing? Yeah, basically. But I think the biggest thing was the return in the second wave was the return of schools and universities in September, October. You know, 1.5 million university students moving around the country. Despite a lot of the talk about schools weren't a vector, a transmission belt for the virus, they were. All the evidence points towards the fact now that they, although most children don't get seriously ill or even show any symptoms from it, they do get the virus and pass it on. And both of those were major transmission belts. And I think over the summer, the encouragement from the government to eat out to help out, or as I called it, eat out to spread out, which is what it did to the virus, I think made major mistakes around all of that. Somebody asked an interesting question, which is, how long does it take the government from knowing new information on COVID to acting on it, such as the new strains? That was Evie. Thank you, Evie. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think it shouldn't take the government very long at all. The government knew about the new strain, for example, very, very quickly. It was identified. We've got, because of the ability, actually largely in the private sector, the ability to profile the genetic makeup of viruses very, very quickly. We're one of the few countries in the world that has as widespread capacity as we've got, and as fast capacity. We'd identified the fact that the strain that emerged in Kent was a new strain very, very quickly. The problem's been government's response to it, and that is largely down to the politicians. There've been plenty of evidence that once the official expert advice has been passed on to politicians, there's been an awful lot of, if I was being pejorative, I'd say dithering about how to respond to it and not use the information that was available quickly enough. Last one I'll just deal with now, and then we'll see if we've got some other questions. How relevant will the roles of the government officials who have been at the forefront of this pandemic be once it's over? That's an interesting one. And it depends what you mean by government officials, because of course there are two classes of government officials. There's the elected political leaders who take the roles of Secretary of State for Health or Education or Transport or all the other important roles around this. And then there's the government officials, permanent officials, things like the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Scientific Officer, the heads of the NHS, and so on. And I think the consequences will be different for the two different groups. I think we will see some people leaving office when there's a reorganisation, a reshuffle in government once it is all over. I think some secretaries of state have been particularly poor in the way in which they've responded to this. I think that's pretty obvious. I think all of them, both elected politicians and permanent officials, at some point are going to be subject to a public inquiry into what happened around this. And I think there are going to be a lot of questions to be answered. So just to single one example out, Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Officer this week, apparently said that he'd been advising the government all along that we should be going hard and fast in response to the epidemic. Well, I can remember Patrick Vallance back last March talking about herd immunity, and yes, you could control some of the virus, but eventually it would be achieving herd immunity through infections, which would stop the virus and that was not terribly helpful at the time. I'm sure he preferred we forgot about that little incident. Right, so I'll stop at that point. Sorry, I've been going on too long anyway, and we'll move on to some questions. Anya,
yeah, thank you.
I'm not pronouncing your name correctly.
Anya.
Anya. Yeah, it's the second N that gets me.
Yeah. I had a question of my own actually. So with, as you said, you know, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme and the things that we've had to do to boost the economy, how do we balance that with a pandemic? Because obviously, like jobs, the economy is important, and how do we find that balance where we're controlling the virus as well as like making sure that the economy isn't completely just going downwards?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I don't think there is a balance. I think you get a better economy by better control of the virus. And there's some very interesting, I've been looking through the academic literature on this, and there's some really interesting studies from the flu pandemic after the First World War in 1918, which spread right across the world. And there's some very, very good studies from the United States that show that American cities that locked down hardest, caused the most short-term economic pain, fared best long-term in their economies. Those cities that tried to not lock down actually suffered the worst economic consequences as well as the worst health consequences. And I think that's pretty clear as well in this pandemic. I mean, New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea is slightly different because they managed it in a slightly different way. But all of them took extremely strong measures to suppress the virus, and their economies are fine. We've suffered not as badly as we thought. There's some interesting recalculations this week. We're probably about average of the big European countries in terms of economic consequences, but we've suffered something in real terms like a 16 to 20% drop in GDP, which is the biggest in about 300 years, as a consequence of not getting control of the virus. So I think this argument about, you know, it's a trade-off between letting the economy just function normally and suppressing the virus is the wrong way of looking at it. If you suppress the virus properly in the first place, we'd be back to economic normality now, and we're still not back nearly a year into the virus.
Yeah. Okay, we have a few questions in the chat. So someone has asked, what is your opinion on English votes for English laws?
Yeah, we have a sort of, we have a strange situation in the UK where essentially there's two sorts of states, democratic states in the world. Ones are unitary states, where essentially you have a central government. They all have local governments mostly, except for very small countries. They all have some form of local government, but you don't have the in-between tier of states as you do. We've got several larger countries with federal structures like the United States, Canada, Australia, Germany, are all much more federalized. We've ended up, since devolution to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland started in the late 1990s, we've ended up with somewhere sort of halfway in between. And it's extremely difficult to get a proper federal structure in the UK because England is 80% of the UK. So if you have a proper federal structure, the other three components of the federation would always be outvoted by England. I mean, other countries have the same problem. In the United States, for example, some of the states are tiny compared to California, which is enormous, but there's enough of them, there's 50 states, so it sort of balances itself out a bit. Whereas in the UK, we've only got those 4 regional structures. So I do think we need to restructure government to reflect more the fact that, for example, the Department for Education, the Department for Health, the Department for Transport are largely English departments now. Even the Home Office, which has some UK-wide responsibilities, but the majority of what it does in terms of supervising police and particularly the police, which is by far the largest bit of responsibility, is purely for England. Police are controlled by the regional governments, the devolved governments elsewhere. So I do think we need to either follow that through and have more English structures and maybe split, so we have an English Department of Health and then the UK-wide functions managed by something at Westminster, which has responsibility for those UK-wide functions. So yeah, I do think we need to do more of that, and part of that probably would be more English votes for English laws, which means removing Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland MPs from votes on things which purely affect England. But we do need to sort it out. But I don't think you can sort it out just on the basis of votes around laws. I think you need to think much more broadly about the structure of the British state as it is now. There was an interesting one here about the comparative question from Francesca, saying, how is it possible to compare strategies used in Australia against COVID versus strategies used in the UK, when Australia's population density and population is far smaller than the one here? Well, actually, it's not, Francesca. The population density in terms of where people live, how near they live to each other, is actually far higher in the United States. In Australia, because most people, something like 95% of the population, live in a handful of really big cities, Melbourne and Sydney. I spent quite a lot of time in Australia over the years, and most people actually live closer to each other than we do in the UK. We have much more spread out with much more small towns and smaller cities than Australia does. The same thing's true in New Zealand, by the way. Everybody thinks, New Zealand's a big landmass, therefore everybody lives spread out. Well, they don't actually. 80% of the population live in 2 cities. So no, there are difficulties about comparisons. You're absolutely right, and you have to be very careful about that. I've spent the last 30 years of my life doing comparative studies between different countries about the way in which governments are organised, and it's very easy to make mistakes because of not understanding things like that. So yeah, it is difficult, but there are comparisons that you can make, and I think it's pretty, when you've got the order of magnitude differences that we've got, where Australia's managed to contain the virus in such a way that they've had less than 1,000 deaths in a population which is about half the size of ours, and we've had 80 times, 90 times that number of deaths, then clearly I think policies are an important factor. It's not just geographical size of the countries or population densities, which are the things that have affected it. Did you have any others that you wanted to?
I think, well, I just had a quick one as well, where about sort of just a number of U-turns that the government has made, and why has there been such a reluctance to bring in, I guess, lockdowns to, close schools, to do this and that, when is the government sort of more aware of the economy than the pandemic, or like why has there been such a reluctance?
Yeah, it's partly economic, and obviously there's been a strong lobby, sorry, excuse me, and there's been a strong voice, particularly from the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, to say that, we should open up as much as possible and the economy should be freed up as much as possible. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think Boris Johnson as Prime Minister is well known for having fairly libertarian political beliefs. He's extremely reluctant to impose restrictions on people. He's made that very clear himself and stated that fairly obvious. And it goes against the grain for him to do things like impose lockdowns. So there have been strong lobby groups wanting to open up the economy, but there was also, I think, a tendency in government to not want to do that. And you can have a interesting philosophical and political argument about whether or not that's the right thing to do and how far you should go in restraining the population in order to contain the virus. And a lot of people wouldn't like the sort of things that's happened in South Korea, for example, or in Taiwan, where you get daily, in some cases, you get daily visits from the police to check that you're isolating. And you can actually be, or even more extreme in China, where you can simply be locked in your buildings by the police and not let out, and only have food fed in through the doors. So there are real arguments about how far government should go in those situations, and I do recognise that. But there's been a tendency, I think you're right, to not to want to lock down, then leave it too long, and then lock down and find that we've got the worst of both worlds, in the sense that we've got the lockdown and the consequences of not having lockdown fast enough. And I think if we been a bit harder to start with, we'd actually be in a much better position now than we are. I was interested what at the end here. I've got, do you think the US Congress is more powerful than Parliament? Yes, is the simple answer. Mainly because of the constitutional relationship between the executive, which is the President of the United States, and Congress, is built into the US Constitution. We have what is essentially in the UK still a monarchical system, where the powers of the monarch, as would have been the case a couple of centuries ago, have gradually devolved down to the Prime Minister of the day, who has enormous powers under Crown prerogative powers, which US presidents would probably give their right arms for. And can, because of our party system as well, can, if they've got a majority in Parliament, can easily overrule any opposition in Parliament much more simply than they can in the US. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that in the UK we've got one central government, we've got 3 devolved governments, we've got within England about 350 local authorities. One of my American public administration colleagues reckons that there are 93,000 governments in the United States, most of them on a constitutional basis, not even on a legal basis. And this is an important point to make as well, by the way. The Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Parliament, Northern Ireland Assembly, all exist on the basis of legislation in the Westminster Parliament. Any of them could be abolished tomorrow if there was a majority of vote in Parliament. You couldn't do that in the United States. It's written into the US Constitution. You'd have to get constitutional amendments through. It requires 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress, the assent of all 50 states to those sorts of constitutions, and so on and so on and so on. So our system is far more executive dominated than the US is. And there have actually been periods in US history where the presidency was even weaker than it is now, where Congress effectively ran the federal government through the committee system, a bit like the way in which English local government used to run, where you had committees that ran the various services in local government. The US federal system was a bit like that 100 years ago, where congressional committees effectively ran US federal services. So yeah, the simple answer is the UK Parliament is far weaker than the US Congress.
What do you think about the way COVID responses have protected the vulnerable/elderly, but damaged the long-term lives of young people potentially who've lost education in the short term and will have to pay for the economic status in the long term too?
Right, yeah. Well, as I said, I've got personal experience of that at one end of the spectrum, which is I'm one of the elderly vulnerable people. And at the other end, I've got a 16-year-old son at the other end of the corridor here who's stuck at home trying to do his GCSEs from home. So I've seen both ends. It's obviously been horrible for both school age in particular youngsters, and for elderly and vulnerable people. And vulnerable doesn't necessarily just mean elderly. I mean, anybody who's immunocompromised, for example, has had major problems. I've actually been, I realized it was starting fairly early, and I've been shielding since the end of February, beginning of March last year. I started before the government. And in terms of support, I think we've been pretty bad, actually. We've been pretty bad with people in my position. The first information I got about how to protect myself was towards the end of April, when I got a letter from the Department of Health. I mean, I knew what to do for myself, and I'm in a fairly privileged position of being retired with a reasonable pension and a house and so on. A lot of people in far worse positions than I am, who were given no information at all about what they ought to be doing until mid-April. And at the other end of the spectrum, I think we've been really bad on dealing with the sorts of mental health problems that are generated by kids being locked down, not being able to go out and see anybody, stuck in their rooms. I mean, some of them obviously are fairly resilient. I think my son thinks being stuck in his room with his Xbox is a wonderful thing, but there's a lot of people who don't feel like that. And I've suffered mightily, and I don't think we've provided anything like the sort of emotional and expert support we should have done for them. And the thing that's upset me most, I think, is simply the lack of creativity. There's been huge creativity at local levels. I've seen it around me here in Bedford, where lots of voluntary organisations, the Gurdwaras, the mosques, the churches, lots of voluntary organisations getting involved and doing all sorts of really spectacular things in terms of trying to help to support people. Local government's been not too bad, although they've been a bit clumsy, I think, in places, and central government's been hopeless, in my view, in terms of providing proper support for people who are suffering in this horrible situation we've all found ourselves in for the past year.
Someone's also asked, do you think the blame lies mostly with the people who broke the lockdown rules or government decisions?
I don't think you can separate it out in that way. I think some of it's to do with government decisions. Some of it's to do with, I mean, people need to have trust in government. If you're going to do things like not go out and visit people in other households, not go out and visit your relatives or friends, you have to have trust that government's asking you to do that with good reason, and government are doing it themselves. And I do think that particularly the Dominic Cummings episode really undermined trust in government in a huge way. Not that he did it, but the government defended him doing it. If he'd have been forced to resign or apologise or whatever, I think that would have made a difference. But it really created a very strong impression that there was one rule for everybody else, but government people could do what they liked. And I think that really undermined trust. You're right, there is, there's always a minority who, for various reasons, just through irresponsible behaviour or for cultural reasons, are going to not necessarily adhere to what's going on. I mean, just to give you an example from Bedford, we have a huge Italian population or Italian descent population in Bedford. They have very large extended families. And I know from the estate that I live on, because I've seen it happening all the way through the crisis, some neighbours of ours, for example, had last Easter had 12 cars parked outside the house over the Easter bank holiday weekend, when we were supposed to be in lockdown and people weren't supposed to be visiting each other. So there has been some remarkable irresponsible behaviour, sometimes by young people, sometimes by older people who ought to know better. I think it's a mixture of things, and people are just going to get tired as well when something's gone on as long as this. I know I haven't been inside. My wife still goes out and does some supermarket shopping. We get most of it delivered. She asked me what I'd like from the supermarket. I can't remember what the inside of a supermarket looks like anymore after a year. So, and there's a temptation to want to go out and go and look. And so I understand that completely. but I do think the government has made some serious policy mistakes and made it harder for people to stick to the rules, particularly when they kept chopping and changing them so often, so that people, I mean, I'm retired. I've had the time. I've been following all this stuff. I got to the point where I was completely lost about what the local rules were applying to us. I mean, it didn't matter too much to me because I'm not going out anyway. But if you'd asked me to say detailed questions about what the rules were, I couldn't have answered them because they changed them so often.
I just think we'd have time for one more quickly. It's on a sort of different topic, but all related. Do you think the government has responded adequately to the free school meals situation?
Well, I think most people would say no. It's pretty obvious that, and the fact they've backtracked every time. I was beginning to wonder who the Prime Minister was, whether it was Marcus Rashford or Boris Johnson at one point. It's pretty obvious they failed to deal with that. And again, actually, it's quite interesting about the theme of what I was saying earlier about the tendency of the government to want to privatize and outsource everything. It's pretty obvious in the last couple of weeks that some of that has gone badly wrong in relation to school meals, in terms of the lunch boxes that were being sent out, which were a joke. I mean, my wife and I sat here trying to work out how you would make meals out of the stuff that was sent out in some cases, and it was just impossible. So yeah, I think it's been badly handled. And what I find surprising from the government's, from sort of self-interest, purely political self-interest point of view, it didn't cost a lot of money, and they could have got themselves a lot of brownie points by doing it properly from the start. And instead, every time they've resisted pressure to do it properly and then caved into it, which, I don't understand why they've done that, because it would have been, it's not like they were saving huge amounts of money, and they could have, just from a purely political point of view, done themselves a lot of good by handling it a lot better. So it's a very strange one to me, why they've behaved like that.
That's just about all we have time for, but thank you so much.
That's all right.
I have so many questions more I wish I could ask, but I've learned so much from it. I understand it so much more. So thank you very much, and I'm sure everyone else does as well. And we've covered a really good array of topics, I think, as well. So thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. And I'm stuck here, so if you want another one anytime, I'm here.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.